Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. So yes, thank you again. And so today we have Denise-Marie Ordway, Neil Bedi, and Rachel Lovell. Neil Bedi is a reporter for ProPublica. While at the Tampa Bay Times, he won the 2021 Pulitzer Prize for local reporting for an investigation into a predictive policing project that harassed residents and profiled adolescents. He was a finalist for the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting for a series investigating high death rates at a Florida Children's Hospital's cardiac surgery unit. Thank you, Neil, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And then we have Rachel Lovell. She is an assistant professor of criminology and director of the Criminology Research Center at Cleveland State University in Ohio. Since 2015, she has been the principal investigator on several research projects on untested sexual assault kits. As an advocate for reporter-researcher collaborations, she has helped journalists investigate issues such as sexual violence and human trafficking. And lastly, we have Denise-Marie Ordway. She trains journalists in academic research methods as part of her role as the managing editor of the journalist resource here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Previously, she reported for several newspapers and radio stations in the US and Central America. And in 2013, she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in local reporting for an investigative series she led on hazing at Florida A&M University. So now I will turn it over to Denise, who will be acting as the host for this webinar.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for those introductions. I am very excited today, and I welcome you all to what is our final Journalist Resources final training session of 2022, Academic Research as an Investigative Journalism Tool. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about how journalists can use academic research and work with researchers to guide and strengthen their coverage at different steps of the investigative journalism process. I want everyone to know we're gonna be talking for about 40 minutes. We're gonna leave the last 20 minutes for questions. And if we get a lot of questions, and I hope we do get a lot of questions, we'll be able to stay a little bit longer. But if you do need to leave right at noon, of course, please do that. I'm gonna start with a couple of logistical things just to make you aware. Let's see, there we go. A couple of quick things. So please write your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. You don't have to wait to the end. As the questions come to you, go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. Like I said, we're going to use the last 20 minutes for audience questions. And you'll have the option of asking them yourself. We can hear you, but we won't be able to see you, or a staff member can read them for you. The session is being recorded, and toward the end of the webinar, check the chat box for links to tip sheets that we think will be really helpful to you. We've, I think it's 5 or 6 tip sheets we'll be adding in there, links to them. They are tip sheets that we've created at Journalist Resource, aimed at helping journalists understand research, find research, get around paywalls, that kinds of things. So I'm gonna do one more thing just to make sure we're all on the same page when we talk about academic research. Before we get into our discussion, when we talk about academic research, we are talking about a scientific or scholarly investigation of an issue or a problem. Often it's led or conducted by college or university faculty. It's peer-reviewed and published in an academic journal. Now that we've got that out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with a question that I would like to pose to both Neil and Rachel. To get us started, when a journalist is first beginning to report on an issue or a problem, can you both talk about how it would be helpful to confer with, to look for research, to how they can use research to guide them in that first step?
Yeah, so that's a great question. From a reporter's perspective, at the start of any investigation, you are typically not the expert on the topic you're looking into. Often you might be coming into a topic completely fresh, but there are people who have been researching and looking into these topics for years as a living. And so if you learn to tap into these people and their work early, you can get pretty good at building a foundation of sourcing, a foundation of your own expertise through interviews, through reading their work. And that's important because anytime you're going to do an investigation, you kind of need that expertise because you're about to say something usually damning or negative about something, and you need to know your stuff if you're going to do that.
I would say very similar to what was said before by Neil, is that I think academic researchers and journalists, especially investigative journalists, actually want to know the same thing or the same general topic. They have the same questions, which is, so what, who cares about this topic? What do we know about the topic? Who is it effective for? Who is it not effective for? How can we make this thing better? Those kinds of questions are similar questions for reporters and researchers. However, researchers go about answering it differently than a journalist would. And there's different, they answer it with in different sorts of ways. And so although we're both asking the same questions, we both have different approaches to doing it. So I think it's actually, especially for these bigger like policy types of things, you really need a researcher to help you understand, as Neil said, like you weren't necessarily the one that spent their entire career researching the topic. And, and so talking to the individuals who are also asking similar questions, I think is an important way to contribute to this, to the conversation about that, and often use data, but in different sorts of ways. So researchers tend to be able to know where to find the data to answer those questions, or have done their own stuff, and or help point a researcher or a reporter in the right direction for kind of where to start looking for where data might exist to answer some of the questions that they're interested in.
If I could follow up, Rachel, from a researcher's perspective, are researchers, do they want to help journalists? Are many of them, most of them, would they be willing to do more than just answer a couple questions? Because, you might ask them to read a document or take a look at your data analysis. Are they willing to give you more of their time?
I mean, I think overall, yes. I think there's, I think, well, first of all, researchers think that their topic is the most interesting thing that has ever existed in the whole world. They are obsessed with their topic. They think it's the most interesting in the world. And so they think other people think that their stuff is the most interesting thing in the world. And so even in its most basic sort of narcissistic sort of way, yes, they want to talk about themselves. But more than that, they often are very passionate about the topic. And so they want good coverage of it. They want it to be done well. I think, though, that the overall, we, especially for those not in journalism or didn't go to journalism school, we don't really have a good sense of how it works or what the rules are. Like, what's the difference between on the record and off the record? What's the difference between background? And so, and they may be just weary about having their findings be misinterpreted or a sort of gotcha sort of thing. I mean, I have certainly seen my research be grossly misrepresented or misinterpreted, intentionally or unintentionally. Sometimes don't really know, but so I think there's some weariness to that. So I think if you can establish some of those relationships and the trust that goes into building some of those things, then and having respect for each other's disciplines in that space, then I think that they could, researchers are a lot more willing to be able to reach out and spend the time to read something or say, can you give me your advice on this, or can you help direct me? And another thing that researchers are really good at is we get things behind paywalls, as you sort of mentioned before. So we are able to access much of the research that is not available, at least for free, to reporters. And so being able to say, hey, can you help me find some things on this? Once you have an established relationship, I have worked with Rachel Lovell, and we've published actually academic articles together, as well as research projects that she published, and in the Cleveland Plain Dealer. And that built off of that sort of already established relationship where we were willing to kind of, help out. Or she may ask a question, hey, do you know anything about this? And so I send her to a person who I may know, or to an article I may know, or something along those lines.
That leads me to another question that I would like to ask both of you, in terms of we know that we can go to a journal, or we can go to a researcher, or we can go to the library or Google Scholar to find research. But in terms of finding the researcher who has that very narrow expertise on the topic that we're interested in, can you both weigh in on, how do you do that? How do you find that person that's good, that's going to be most helpful to you?
I can say with almost 100% certainty that whatever the topic is going to be, especially as it relates to like policy work and investigative journalism, that there is a researcher out there who is studying that topic. It's a matter of finding them. And so I think sometimes reporters are really just interested in that 1 second soundbite, or that one little last closing quote at the end of a story. And that's okay. So if you wanted to know, for example, I don't necessarily do research on body cams and police and the effectiveness of those. However, as an academic and a criminologist, I have a pretty good understanding of what the research says at a high level, right? So if you want to know high level, what is the research kind of saying, I could answer that. If you wanted one soundbite, or, or something like that. If you really want to know much more about what does this mean, and under what context, and with who, and under those kinds of questions, then you need to go to someone who's going to be able to really answer that question in a much more intensive sort of way. And the thing is that academics tend to think of their know-it-alls. And I mean, to be fair, we kind of do know a lot, because we spend that's part of our job. And so we want to be a know-it-all, and we want to answer questions that may not necessarily be in our area. So one of the things I would suggest is for journalists to, if they really want to find the person that's studying that topic specifically, then ask them for their research on that topic. And if they've published stuff and or have written stuff or have data in that area, then they're likely to be more of an expert, as compared to if you go through my CV, you won't find stuff on body cam policing, because that's not something that I specifically do. Does that make sense?
Yes, of course. And Neil, I'm interested to hear from you as a reporter. How are you finding those people who are going to be able to give you that very specific information?
Yeah, I think there's an art to it, and a bit of a process. Usually in my investigations, I have some time to actually talk to people, have these conversations, not just get the quick soundbite. And with that, that typically means when I'm starting looking for researchers, one, I'll go in and start reading academic papers, even if half of it is completely confusing to me and doesn't make any sense. You should make it part of your process to try to read the papers, understand what you can understand, and notice the authors on the papers. If you find papers that seem very relevant, start building a list of the authors on those papers and reach out to them. Talk to the ones who are willing to talk, have conversations with them. Make it clear you have been paying attention to their work. I think they appreciate that, rather than just a reporter blind calling them who seems to not know anything about what they're talking about.
Excellent point.
explain that you know what you've been reading their research and you noticed this quote or this finding in their research and you're more curious about it. And if you have the time, often you aren't going to find that perfect researcher from your first phone call, but it's an art of building a list of researchers that you can talk to, that you know their expertise, that you can ask them. So I'm looking into this really specific thing. I know that isn't what you're working on, but who would you suggest I reach out to? And that is just a process. That is a process of doing the reporting, talking to all these people. And it's not like you're wasting time if you don't get the perfect researcher on a number of these phone calls, because they're going to be helpful down the road anyway.
Great. And can you both offer us some tips for, like, how do you reach out to a researcher? Like, what's the best way to do that? Is it email? Is it call? Is it Twitter? And then what about developing a relationship with them? There might be some journalists who aren't sure. Maybe they haven't spoken to a lot of academics in terms of their beat work. Like, how do you do that? How do you develop a relationship with them? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, Rachel, correct me about any of this, but typically I've found that researchers prefer email for the first reach out, mostly because they want to be able to think about what they're going to talk about. They want to have the time to like give it some thought. And if you have the time to let them have a few days to respond to you, to think about talking to you, I've always just had more luck with an email where the conversation could get started. I do, like I said, try to make it clear that I've been reading their work. I've been trying to understand their work. And so that's really important too. And then if this is a months-long investigation, you don't make it just one phone call and then never talk to them again. It is a process. Early on, you are learning about a topic and you are asking them to explain complicated things as if you were 5 years old, because that is important. And you need that as a journalist, because you're going to have to explain it to your readers who know nothing about this topic. But then as you start to hit difficult questions that they've probably hit, and you're going really deep into this investigative reporting process, you're reaching back out to them to start discussing stuff that they love talking about. And those conversations over time, you build a really good relationship with the people.
Yeah, I would say most of the time I have been contacted, it's over email. I think and I think it is sort of effective in that sort of sense to say, like, am I the right person for you to speak to, or can I refer you to somebody else, or, that's not really my area. There are some, for example, the ACJS, the Academy for Criminal Justice Sciences, which is a big criminology organization, academic one, has like a Criminal Justice Research Alliance, like a group of a group of us who are willing to like speak to it. So you could like go to their website and say, okay, I want a person on this topic, and they can help connect you in that sort of way. But I mean, I can speak recently. I think the relationship that I developed with a reporter where we wrote some stuff together, developed, and I think the best part was that it was unstructured. So like we were on a similar topic, but we had opportunities to have, and sometimes that's really difficult with deadlines and other things, but the best questions and the best topics from my research and her stories actually came out of unstructured conversations about like certain things. And so recently I was contacted from a reporter who was new to the area and was doing a similar beat. He was working in policing. And so he was like, hey, I'm new to this area. I've heard you do the research in this area. Can we have coffee? And can you just tell me about what you do and who you know and who I should talk to and all those sorts of things. And so we actually, like you said, researchers love to talk. So we spent like 2 hours in the student center having coffee, and I got to talk all about my research, but I also said, like, these are the people you should talk to, and these are these sorts of things, and this is big topic that I'm hearing about or whatever. And so it has that sort of like an opportunity to build on it. And then an actual lead story came out of an article that I had just finished publishing, because he asked me about that. But he was more like, hey, let me know if something else comes up, or we may talk here. So there's more of like an established relationship with someone more locally.
And just to clarify, Rachel, when you said the article came out, you were talking about an academic article, correct?
Well, yeah, so actually
Okay.
both. So like I
Okay.
had an academic article come out that was right before we talked, and then in a peer-reviewed journal. And then he was like, oh, I want to know more about that. And so then he wrote an article. He wrote his own story that was a lead headline story in the paper based off the article the study that I did. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And one more clarification, when you were talking about how you ran into that journalist when it was an environment, an unstructured environment, can you talk, like, what does that mean? Were you at a meeting together?
Yeah. So we were
Okay.
at community meetings together, and we both are named Rachel. And so they would refer to us as like the Rachels who sat in the community meetings. And so, the Rachels then sat together and talked. And, and then it was like, oh, do you know something about this? Oh, do you know something? So it was an opportunity to like be in the same space, which I think is a little bit idiosyncratic, but I think if there's opportunities to encourage unstructured conversations in an environment where, where you don't feel like you're constantly being quoted, then, at least in those conversations, then, like, you could, a lot more can come out of it, because you're not so, it's like putting a camera on somebody, like you're like, here, smile, and you're like, like, right, like you get really, if it's too structured, you get a little too like formulaic and not able to kind of get to the point, I think, where you want to go.
So that kind of like falls into that relationship development.
Right.
Neil, do you find yourself when you're talking to researchers, whether it's in the beginning or farther down the investigative process, are you speaking to them like on background, so where you're not quoting them but you're getting information, or how do you know when to do that, and how often do you not quote someone, allow someone to speak without being worried about being quoted?
Yeah, so it usually depends researcher by researcher, and usually you also want to get a sense of a specific researcher's experience with the media. But I'm typically totally fine with being on background for the early conversations. I kind of want those conversations to be a bit more natural, to be a bit off the cuff, allow researchers to say things they don't want to say on the record, because it can allow you to learn more things. It can allow you to get some tips from them that they don't necessarily want published under their name. And generally you have time to later come back to them for an on-the-record quote about a certain thing. And so I'm always fine with that early on. This is talking about a specific piece that I worked on, but I'm fine with it even the entire time. If a researcher is willing to help me, willing to make sure I'm getting something right, but just never wants to be quoted, that is okay with me in an investigation, because in an investigation, one of the number one priorities is, do you get something right? And having a researcher may not be on the record, but is knowledgeable about the topic, who can look over something with you, can be incredibly valuable. I worked on this series of stories in 2018 about surgical outcomes at a pediatric heart center. And part of that story, I have a background in data analysis, and I had built this analysis on the center's outcomes over 10 years. And it was a really complicated analysis. There were researchers out there who did very similar analyses out there. But a lot of them did not want to talk on the record because it was a Johns Hopkins center, and they didn't want to be on the record about Johns Hopkins. And I was okay with that because I just wanted them to review my analysis, look at the code, look at the data. Would they do this? And by letting them be on background, they were willing to go back and forth with me and say, hey, I would tweak this in your analysis. I would do this, I would do that. And by the end of it, they told me, yeah, this is as good or better than anything I would do. And that's what I needed in my head before I was about to publish. These surgeries are going bad.
Oh gosh. So let me get, if I could ask a clarification question. So it's great to rely on academics and researchers to get a full picture of an issue to help them, to get them to be able to feel free to look over an analysis, for example. But I mean, you do have to have some people to quote, right? And to name. So maybe you could talk about that. I mean, how do you know who to allow, who should be allowed to be on background, or, you know, share freely without being worried about being quoted? And like, how do you make those choices?
Yeah, I mean, so usually very early on in those first conversations with researchers, I have the conversation about on the record, on background, what they're comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with, especially if they haven't done many media interviews. You want to explain that to them and explain their options. And typically, yes, I need a group of researchers who are willing to be on the record. And often I am very interested in those who are willing to be on the record. But it is a person by person conversation. You're not trying to surprise anyone with their name in the paper. You're not trying to get them. And if you have the time, it makes sense to build the trust. And sometimes even someone who wants to be on the background at the very beginning, if they're talking to you throughout your process, if they know the quality of the work you're doing, they might be willing to switch, and you can have that conversation with them down the line as well, and say, hey, look, I'm getting close to publishing. We've been talking a lot. I know you're an expert in this. I would love to quote you. Can we talk about that? And so it is important, but I've never had like a situation where I can't find any researchers who will be on the record when I really need one, because they're more willing than not to talk about their work and be quoted.
Awesome. And I'm going to get you to talk a little bit more about using research and working with researchers on other steps of the investigative journalism process. Could you help us understand, the early middle and the late middle and the end? Like how is research helpful? Like the written document, how is that helpful? And working with the researchers, how, if the aim here is to try to get, to try to uncover, different ways that journalists can think about using research and working with researchers, how that can be helpful to them.
Yeah. So I think I talked about the beginning a lot already, but the beginning is you getting a foundation of sourcing, a foundation of knowledge. So you're talking to people, you're understanding, you might not even know exactly what you're honing into in your investigation, but you are building this knowledge base. In the middle is when both you start to realize what you might focus on, and also you start to hit a bunch of roadblocks. And that is the perfect time to start having conversations with researchers, which are a bit more back and forth, a bit more like you're solving a problem together. And researchers are really helpful for that too, because typically they've thought about this problem way more than you have. Or if they haven't, they can talk it through with you. They can suggest how to go about it. And that's also when, like, if you are doing a database story and you're looking at specific data sets, you want to talk to researchers who've already worked with those data sets, who know the pitfalls of working with these data sets, who know the best ways to get the data, to analyze the data, et cetera. So the middle part is usually that conversation where you're getting through roadblocks, where you're figuring out what you're focusing on, where you're gut checking yourself too. You might think you have a story, and you want to make sure that the experts in the subject agree that this is a fruitful path forward. And then I think usually the end is a bit of both bulletproofing. When you have your findings, you have the goods, and you want to make sure that you haven't missed something, you haven't skipped a step that could really hurt you after you publish. That's what I'm usually talking to researchers to make sure what I've done makes sense. And then also reaction, getting their thoughts as an expert in the field. on what you have just found, because sometimes you are bringing new findings, new knowledge to this field, and they're really interested in giving you those reactions. And so bulletproofing, reactions. And then one thing I skipped is that often the research those researchers have done, the academic papers they've put out, their own findings are support for your investigation. You should know what's out there so that you can cite it. It makes your story stronger when you are citing peer-reviewed research that has been out there. And so know what's out there, know what's relevant to your topic, and have the knowledge to cite that in your stories.
Mm-hmm.
Rachel, do you have anything else that you could add from a researcher's perspective?
Yeah, I would say in terms of I think it's been helpful to me, and it certainly makes me and I think others feel a little bit more comfortable, especially if like we're right. So sometimes reporters will come in and they'll say like, hey, so for example, I study sexual violence, and they'll say, hey, so tell me what you know about rape. And you're like, no, that's like, how much time are we going to talk here? Because that's not necessarily the right question that you're really wanting to know, right? Like be very specific about what you want, because otherwise I'm going to get really jargony, and I'm going to get very long-winded, and that's not what you're looking for. So like, if you could be as specific as possible about like, here, tell me what, when does this do that, those kinds of things, or saying like, hey, the prevalence rates we got from this study, does this look okay? What are some of the pitfalls? And so I think researchers are really able to do that well. One thing I think that reporters are very good at it is learning how to navigate public requests that researchers are not necessarily as good at. So the FOIA requests and other kinds of things, there's some really nice collaborations that can be had around those things, around FOIA requests and sort of public records and getting information around that. Researchers aren't usually doing that on a regular basis. Sometimes, but not necessarily. And then the other thing I wrote down as a sort of main point around that is that if a researcher wants to go on record, sometimes it just feels better to be able to have that last editing, or the last ability to look at exactly how the reporter is, or the journalist is writing up the thing, just to kind of give like, okay, you got this right, but like it's not quite right, like change the wording a little bit here, and then it's a correct interpretation of our research. So I understand that journalists need the privacy to be able and then to write their story without input from others, and don't necessarily want to share it, but it's really more of that kind of fact check last minute thing that I think gives researchers more comfort in knowing that you're not going to grossly, or that I'd have an opportunity to at least provide input if you're going to cite the sort of research. And so sometimes mine has been cited incorrectly, and so I didn't know starting out that like it's completely okay to contact the reporter later and go, hey, you this isn't right, like change the wording like this, and it is right, or whatever. I didn't know that that's like a thing that you can do, because researchers, you don't really do that much. Like researchers don't take too often to other people telling them how they should be doing their stuff. So I assumed that the same thing happened, but it's not the case. And so having that little opportunity to like provide input, or say, or just review as kind of a fact check, I think is helpful as well in working with researchers.
Okay. Neil, I wanted to ask you, when you were working on the series Targeted, the investigative series, if I remember correctly, the sheriff's office officials who had developed a predictive policing project, they had told you that the project was based on research that they had, I don't know if they conferred with it or reached out to the researchers, but they had gotten this research on who commits crime and had developed this program based on that research. But you decided to like look further into that issue. And I was wondering if you could talk about like why did you second guess them? And what did you learn, and what did it add to your coverage?
Yeah. I think it comes back to the fact that if you're an investigative reporter, if you're working on an investigation, you should second guess everything. And that includes the research itself. And in this case, we were looking at this program that a local sheriff had created and had been running for years, that looked at various data sources to determine who in the county was most likely to commit crimes in the future. And they had this manual that described the program. Throughout the manual, they cite criminal justice research, researchers who've been cited all over the place in criminal justice reporting. And so on its face, this manual looked like it was very well sourced. It was based on real science. And they loved that too. They loved saying it. When we started questioning the program, they started pointing back at those researchers, pointing back at the science they were using. And so as an investigative reporter, the first thing was just to question it, not just take it at its face, but call those researchers, figure out how they were using this work to justify their program, which we had started to find was really problematic. And that's just the very basic investigative journalist instinct. And it turned out to be really important in this case, because as we started calling these researchers who they were citing over and over and over again, they were saying, what do you mean my work is being used this way? This is a terrible program. My work should never be used this way. They're going way off of our conclusions and creating a program that is harassing children. And I think one researcher equated it to child abuse. And it was just this incredible moment where a lot of the response from the sheriff's office was this research, was this science. It was a sound program. And just by being able to call those same academics, talk to them, figure out if they believed in this program, if they believed in how their research was cited in the manual, showing them the pages where they were cited, they were quick to say, no, this isn't how this works. This shouldn't be how my work is used. And it really helped show that their main defense wasn't solid at all.
I love that example. I think that's a fantastic example. And I could ask a lot more questions. We're getting really close to our cutoff mark. So I'm gonna stop right there and share just a couple quick things with everyone. Let's see. The screen is good. Let's see. Okay, I'll just tell you what I was going to tell you because I can't seem to find it, so forgive me. Forgive me for that. So what I wanted to tell everyone is that I think there's like 5 or 6 tip sheets that we're sharing in the chat box. One of them, if I'm remembering correctly, talks about the questions that journalists should ask to gauge whether a piece of research they're looking at is a quality piece of research, or if it's a flawed or biased piece of research. So that can be really helpful. Another one that I'm sure we put in the chat box has to do with, how to find research for free. So how to get around paywalls legally, and how to find it other ways, quickly. If you're a journalist and you reach out to a journal, a lot of times they'll give you either a special code or they'll give you a special account that will allow you to read research for free. So lots of ways to get at it, because I know a lot of newsrooms don't pay for those subscriptions and you probably don't have time to go down to the local library. So you might want to check that out. Also, there are 2 tip sheets that we have created based on my earlier conversations with Neil and Rachel about their work. When I think it was right before the Pulitzers were announced. Neil and his colleague were finalists for a Goldsmith Prize that the Shorenstein awards every year. And I had chatted with him about his work and how he did it. And a big theme that rose out of our conversations was how he had used research at the various steps of his process. And I was very excited because I really like research, and I know it is a very powerful tool. So I wanted to share that. I wanted to encourage you also to sign up for our newsletter. So the journalist resource, we produce lots of stuff. We create roundups of research. We put together tip sheets to help journalists. And if you sign up for our weekly newsletter, that's a place where we share our new content, and then also remind you of content that we've created before that can help you with something that's in the news today in terms of your coverage. So those are the things I wanted to remind you about. Carolyn, I'm gonna let you, I guess, identify questions to ask.
Sure.
And like I said, if you would like to ask the question yourself, please do so. We can't see you, so you can keep eating lunch or doing whatever you're doing, but we hear you. And if you cannot or would just prefer that Caroline read them, we are absolutely okay with that too.
Okay, so I'm going to have Jill Barchet ask the first question. So Jill, I'm going to take you off mute. Just give me one moment. Okay, go ahead, Jill.
Okay, this seems a bit time consuming. Maybe we should just read the questions. I don't remember exactly my question.
I can go ahead.
I think it was about research means so many different things to different people. And to some researchers, it's just a peer-reviewed exposition of their theories without any evidence to prove it. And some researchers are an expert in the field, and they can give you quite a biased sort of synthesis of how they see the research. And it can often feel like a minefield as a reporter to say, the research says this about a certain topic. Because as we know, most research has mixed findings, and how we sort through it and give the bottom line to readers, I find to be very challenging. And I'm curious what thoughts you have on that.
That's a great question.
I'll say that that is actually one of the pitfalls you really want to avoid while working with researchers, especially if you are working on a pretty long project. I would make sure you're not just having all the same like-minded researchers in your source pool, or just a group of friends who work together and believe the same things and think the same way. You really want to make sure you have researchers that are doing different sides of their work, who maybe don't even know each other, who you can bounce your ideas off, to get a wide reaction and a wide understanding of what they think. Because I think it's really easy to call one researcher, ask them for who else they would talk to, and they choose the people they've worked with or their friends. And then just end up having your source base be this group of friends that doesn't give you an expert to challenge that thinking. And so make sure you are diversifying your source base, that you are talking to a wide group of people, so that you're never caught with one biased interpretation of certain research or understanding.
Rachel?
Yeah, I would say similar things. I mean, I think just as if there's different kinds of journalists, there's different kinds of researchers as well. So there are journalists who, there's journalism that's very interested in just having catchy headlines and getting people to, make up, things about how terrible the world is and other kinds, which actually researchers and reporters also tend to agree on being very negative. So they also tend to see the world as half empty sometimes too. So I mean, I think the same that would go for both sides of that. And I think you can get a general sense, though, from listening to a researcher before too long in terms of, and I'm not discounting my research colleagues who are really much more in the advocacy realm, and then they do research, right? But their role is much more to advocate for a certain perspective. Though that doesn't necessarily discount what they're doing, but that's how they're approaching everything that they're doing, which is, different than some other types of things. So I think you can get a fairly good sense pretty early on how they're talking about what they're doing, and how, if they, certainly ask and bring up, like, are there research out there that doesn't agree with this, or where would I go if I wanted to know, some counterpoint to that sort of research? And they should be able to know some aspects of that.
And I would add, and please correct me if this is not right, Rachel, but trying to get a sense of what the consensus is. That's important if there is a consensus, and we've got a tip sheet on trying to understanding how to interpret and report on consensus. So maybe we could put that in the chat too. And then there's also, when I go to conferences and I go to trainings and I talk to journalists, and one of the complaints I hear about is, how do you report on research when the results often are so contradictory or mixed? And I would remind the journalists to look more closely at the research, that it's often not as contradictory or mixed as it appears, because the research itself might be very different. It might actually have the same findings, but the researcher might be defining certain things differently, or using data from maybe a local population versus a national population. Or, there's so many factors that can affect research findings. So kind of keep that in mind, that if it seems contradictory, it might not be contradictory. It might be very similar. And that's a good kind of prompt to get you to call those researchers and talk to them about what they found. And, did you actually find the same thing? Is it actually the opposite? So I would just, urge you to keep that in mind.
Okay, so the next question is from Shelley Levitt, and I'm just going to go ahead and ask it. So she asked, how much of an obligation do you feel to quote researchers who have been generous with their time in sharing their insights and research? Have you had to push back on an editor who cut quotes?
That's a good question. It's tough because you do want to quote a researcher who's given you a lot of time. At the same time, their quotes might be bad, or the story might just be better without them, or your editor feels really strongly about not having too many quotes in a story, and you might just end up not being able to quote them. And it is a balancing act. I mean, typically what I do is, if they're good quotes that are worth using, I like using them, because I like having quotes from knowledgeable people in my story to back what is in there. But I'm also usually very straight with the people I'm talking to about how this works, what's going to happen, whether or not they're going to be quoted, and make it clear from pretty early on, or at least midway through the reporting process, that, look, we're going to put what we've got on paper. The editing process is the editing process. I can't promise you'll be in the story, but we'll see. And I'll let you know if you do end up in the story. I mean, we have a very strong no surprises policy. I will let you know beforehand that you're going to be in the story. I will fact check that piece with you to make sure the quote is accurate, to make sure I didn't misunderstand the quote. But that is the journalism process. You might lose a quote, and you might upset a researcher who really thought they were going to be quoted, and you have to be ready for that. You have to be straight with them, and I don't know if there's any way around that.
I would say, I mean, I think that those have always, I've worked with reporters that have been clear about that as well. And I think sometimes some might go into it saying, I just want this quote, but like, I think if you are just wanting the quote, there's easier ways to work within the media to get that. And so I think, if someone just said, hey, I really wanted to, it didn't make it, apologies, thank you for all your work, then there's no feelings hurt in that sort of we all have different roles and responsibilities, and respecting that I think is important. I would say that there was mostly what especially if you're not directly citing, just getting their name, affiliation, and a link to the study, or sort of some aspect of saying what they did. If you're actually citing an actual thing, then that's the most that you would probably need to do. Although I know there was a sort of high profile case fairly recently where a high profile media outlet had worked with some researchers who were like, this was their topic, their thing forever. And they talked to them, they, got all this information, they read their books, and then they presented it. It was like, look at this epiphany that I've discovered, and didn't cite any of the like source material where who was doing that topic way before. So they had presented it as like, look at this terrible thing I've uncovered. And you're like, well, that thing I've been writing about for 20 years, you didn't uncover it. So I think, then that's just being respectful on both sides of the equation there as well, about like being respectful of citing, as well as researchers being respectful of citing journalist stuff and the things that they write, because actually journalism goes before research in many ways and uncovers things that were research wasn't there. And so citing those as saying, ProPublica did this one, Vice did this investigative piece, I think is also important.
Okay. And the next question, or I think you may have two, is going to be from Rowan Philp. So Rowan, if you're there, I'm going to allow you to ask directly.
Oh, I was going to go ahead and invite you to read them.
Okay, sure, I will go ahead. So the first one he asked was, given the lag review time on academic research papers, news editors often tell reporters like me that the research data behind the finding is invariably too old to be news. Any tips for getting around this recency concern?
That's an excellent question.
That's a good question. I don't have a great answer off the top of my head. I mean, usually, even if there's lag time, if the findings are relevant and important, it is news. And even if the data, there's a lag, the findings coming out in an academic journal is news. And so usually it's less about whether the data is old and more about making the pitch to your editor in a way that they will see this as news and they will know that this is important to get out there. I mean, if for some reason the findings aren't interesting enough to make that pitch, maybe your editor is right and you shouldn't write about it. But sometimes it's just an art of pitching to your editor something that you think is important, that you think is news, in a way that doesn't focus on the age of the data, but focuses on how new the findings are, how new this is to that specific field, stuff like that.
If I could also, oh, I'm sorry, Rachel.
No, please. I was
just going to add that that it would be worth noting in your report, this is the newest available, and maybe talk about what the process is like. I know with school data, to get data from individual schools across the country can take a very long time. And so they are years behind on data. So kind of explaining that to readers can be helpful. But also one way to bridge that is to get researchers to go, well, that's what it showed 2 years ago. Is it still, do you think that's still the case today, to help kind of bridge it and bring the information forward?
I was going to say something similar that we get, even in academia, sometimes they'll be like, well, your data is 2 years old. And you're like, well, it took me 2 years to get this to you and through peer review. So calm down a little bit, journal articles. But also I think but I get that a lot, especially working in, for example, they'll be like, well, this is from data. Even like my community partners will be like, well, this is from data from like 5 years ago. Like, Cleveland is different now. And you're like, please tell me how vastly different, the community, like maybe there is, and maybe there's a reason why data from a few years ago would show you something completely different now, like the pandemic, for example, would be a good example of something that could disrupt statistics. But if you're talking about general things that don't vary that much, having data that's a couple years old isn't changing your findings really in any meaningful way. You're just adding more information to that. So I would say, kind of push back and say, well, is there a logical reason to think that data from a couple years ago, that the patterns no longer hold now, that the criminal justice system, for example, is substantially different now, or there's some reason to believe in the last 2 years things have changed, is really the I think the larger one. But researchers do work on very different deadlines than reporters. Reporters are like, I got to post and write this 2,000 word essay in 10 minutes. And you're like, I'm sorry, what? Like, like we write much slower. We don't we have very different deadlines. And so being able to navigate those deadlines. I always appreciate when reporters are like, hey, I need this story by Friday. And you're like, okay, cool. I'm working with that. But if you just say, I need something, it could be a while. Because we're on different time schedules.
Great. Okay, so the next question came from Henry Gass. And so he said the idea of partnering with academics, institutions on investigations sounds very appealing. I'm wondering, though, if there are ethical questions for journalists that come with that. For reporters interested in doing that, what ethical guardrails, ground rules should we establish going in? What happens with our notes, for example? Is the raw data kept by both the reporter and the academic institution? If it's a public university, does that raise a conflict in terms of investigating a state government? So things along those lines.
I think I can
great.
at least start. There's a great question, and I can start to speak to some of that because I have published with a reporter, as well as we are actually in the process of setting up a data use agreement for some data that they've collected with my university. And so there's a very structured way to be able to do that within universities, of getting what's called institutional review board approval, as well as contractual obligations that the university is required then to maintain, that lays out the exact rules under which things can be identifiable, notes could be shared, how that notes could be shared, who owns the data afterwards, is it co-owned, whose intellectual property is it? So researchers work out those all the time with grants. And so it's a very natural thing if a reporter wanted to do that as well, that there's very structured environments within a university that lays all of that out. There would be, the general counsel does the contracts, and IRB approves, institutional review board approves. So we have when reporters have shared data with me, I got institutional review board approval that they're saying they're sharing it. I don't own it. They get it back. This is how I can use it to answer these questions and so on.
I've not actually done a full-blown partnership before, so Rachel's answers sound great. Having done other kinds of partnerships before, I would just say you do need to set the ground rules early, and you want to make sure you have these conversations early, because you will be in a mess if you're halfway down the line. Both groups had different ideas of how this was going. And you have to figure it out while also trying to close an investigation. So that's all I have.
If I could follow up with a quick question, Neil. In your investigations, you relied on a lot of researchers. How did you credit them?
I think it really depended on how their work or how they were used. I mean, if I was using them to get their insight and their thoughts about these findings, I would quote them. I would explain why I'm quoting them, why they are an expert in this field. If I'm using their work as a citation in a story, I will explain that straight up. I will say, I will cite the work, I will link to the work, and I'll explain why it's relevant. And then, I mean, there was a moment where I even wanted to, that heart surgery story I was talking about, when I worked on that analysis and I was having researchers review it and sort of bless it. I had actually wanted to have a line there that said, these researchers took the time to review it, to bless it, to agree with it. It was only later that they didn't want to be on the record that we didn't get to do that. But that's how I would have handled that too. Actually, and we published a methodology and I would have been right in there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, the next question came from Lydia Morin, and she was wondering, what are some reasons researchers might not want their work to be reported on?
That's a good question.
These are all great questions.
Yeah, reasons why you don't want it to be reported on. I mean, I think sometimes I think primarily it's the worry about it being misinterpreted or misconstrued, or out of context in some sort of way, that there's that sort of like wrong headline, same as in health research and stuff. And you're like, no, we're not saying if you take this pill, you're going to die of cancer. Like, no one said that kind of like connections. But I think in some cases, like it may not really be something that they are as that is their centerpiece of the story. It may, just as if reporters don't necessarily all write the centerpiece story, academics don't necessarily publish all the things that are their centerpiece. So I can imagine to some extent they wouldn't do that. The other thing I would say is if they didn't want it was that often we have community, especially in the social sciences, we have community collaborators. And so, sometimes it can put us, although it's in the published world, you don't necessarily want a spotlight on something you aren't really prepared to like have a whole investigative kind of piece on that, maybe that you're not, it's a high profile thing and you're not necessarily, wanting a big spotlight on that.
I just want to share a tip on that that you had mentioned. I think one of the easiest, most common mistakes reporters make while citing researchers and research is misinterpreting it. I think if you are relying on one or two phone calls and you're talking about something really complicated, it is really easy to hear one thing, write it down in your notes one way, and it actually being wrong in some technical way or just completely wrong. And it is important as reporters for you to slow down and make sure you understand things right. Ask the researcher, hey, can I explain what I thought I just heard back to you, and make sure that sounds right. Don't rush that process, because you are jumping into something that is really complex, something that someone has worked on for a very long time, and you want to make sure you understand it right.
And I would add, sometimes if it's very complicated, and even outside your beat area, sometimes a lot of them will encourage you and give you a phone number that if it's just like really fast, you're on deadline, to read it back to them if you're comfortable doing that. Mm-hmm. I remember one time I had to write about some astrological finding, and that was not my beat, and it was really complicated. And I just said, hey, I'm going to be writing this. I'll be finished in 30 minutes. Can I call you back? Give me 5 minutes. I just want to read what I've got, because I don't know what you're talking about. So they were delighted. They're like, yep, this is my cell phone number. Call me. I would much rather it be right and take 5 minutes and chat with you. So I often they, if it's a matter of getting it right or wrong, they're willing to give you a little bit more time.
Okay, so it is one, but we do have a few more questions, but feel free to leave, and just wanted to reiterate that the recording will be up on the Shorenstein Center's website as well as JR's website. Okay, so the next one from Stephen Sterrett was, what has been the most shocking thing revealed to you by an academic researcher, on and or off record?
Well, I can't say what's been revealed to me off record because that was off the record. And being honest with your off the record conversations with researchers is actually really important. I'll add that that is part of the trust building exercise. So I would not reveal that. On the record, I think it was really that targeted story for me. It was calling these researchers who then said, this is ridiculous. They became some of the strongest quotes in the story to say, this program is wrong and they are using my research in a terrible way. And they have created something that it just went so far off the rails that it couldn't be considered good policing in any way. It's published and you read it, but in the beginning, I mean, we didn't know if these researchers would say that. We had no idea how they would react. Maybe they, I mean, the sheriff's department said that they worked hand in hand with some of these researchers. So if that was accurate, we assumed that the researchers would defend their work, and it turned out not to be the case, and that was pretty alarming.
Okay, and so the next question is from Penelope Overton, and she asked, what is the best way for a reporter to identify funding sources for research so we can give readers the opportunity to judge potential conflicts?
A lot of that is part of research papers. It is transparent because it's supposed to be transparent. There are rules behind that, and so getting used to reading that in the papers, knowing where things are funded, is important. And I'll say I don't necessarily say it for every time I cite research, but if it is a relevant conflict of interest, it becomes relevant to cite, and you should cite that, or it becomes a finding in the story. If you have found research that is problematic and you have found a conflict of interest, that is suddenly a finding in itself. So there's a process to figure that out, and just getting used to reading it and understanding it is part of being a better reporter.
I would also say that reporters are also welcome to contact the university's compliance office, because researchers are required as part of their employment to declare conflicts of interest, even if it's not necessarily in the funded study. So if I get funding, if it's a certain amount of money to go give a talk, for example, to something, I have to disclose that as a researcher to my compliance office. And so that would be something, if there was an area where you thought a researcher or a reporter thought that there may be a conflict of interest, or that the research was somehow, I don't know, like dubious, or, let's say pharmaceutical kinds of thing or whatever, then you could ask for their conflict of interest forms that they have to submit that may not go in the publication itself, but the university should have that information if the researcher has declared that. But the researcher can get fired if there is a conflict of interest and you're not reporting it. So it is taken seriously within universities.
Okay, I think we'll do two more. So Daniel Fenster asked, do you prioritize researchers at local institutions you can speak with in person, or going straight to the top of the field researchers if they are non-local?
I'll say I try to do a mix, both because it's important not to just have a bunch of researchers from Ivy League schools in your papers left and right, but also because it is really helpful to have people who are local, who you can meet in person, who you can discuss things over with coffee. And if you're working on local journalism, it's important to talk to the researchers who are in the place you are at, who are doing this work in your location. So I do try to make it a mix though, because sometimes there's also a problem with that. Researchers who've been in your community, who've been doing that work, might have tunnel vision, and it's important to go out and have outside reactions. So I just always have a mix.
Great. And so we'll do one more question. Let's see. I did not have somebody lined up, so give me a moment. Okay, we'll do this from Gary Grimm. So he said, given the recent reporting of hot fusion success by journalists, how can journalists guard against a repeat of the cold fusion reporting fiasco of 1989, given that journalists may not have access to the right group of academic experts?
Neil, that's all you, bud.
I admit I don't know what went on there, so hopefully I can be helpful. But I think once again, it's a matter of not just writing a quick hit off of one academic paper, not doing the work to bulletproof what you know, not doing the work to contact other researchers who weren't part of that paper to get their thoughts. I mean, there are often like open secrets among these researchers that know that, yeah, their work is a little fishy. Maybe wait before you publish a big headline based on one paper. So I think it's just a matter of bulletproofing things, matter of always, I mean, being an investigative reporter, second guessing what you're about to write and know that you have it right. So that is just part of the process. And I think usually as you become a more experienced investigative reporter, you have this sense of, oh shit, did I second guess this? Did I double check it, triple check it? And that should just be part of your process.
Great. Thank you very much, both Neil and Rachel. Denise, do you want to say a few things before we wrap up?
No, I just wanted to thank Neil and Rachel for giving us their time. This was a fantastic conversation. I learned from you both, and wanted to remind everyone that we will have this video available. We recorded it, so we'll be following up. We will probably post something on journalistresearch.org about the video, probably summarizing key points with maybe some quotes out more clearly outlining the tips that you could take away. So we'll be doing that shortly. I just wanted to remind you, and thank you all for joining us. We were really thrilled to see how many people were interested in this very important topic.
Yes, thank you again, and happy holidays.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you both. That was great. Thank you.